The exact moment I saw $7,650 disappear from my account at 7:35 de la mañana, I knew this was not a system error, and I knew exactly whose name I was about to see on the transaction log. My name is Olivia Harper, and I still remember staring at my phone screen in complete silence, trying to understand how a balance I checked the night before could suddenly feel so wrong. It was early morning in my apartment in Seattle, the kind of quiet hour where nothing usually happens except coffee, notifications, and slow routines before the day begins. But that morning was different. My banking app had already refreshed itself automatically, and what I saw made my stomach drop before my mind could even fully process the numbers. $7,650. Gone. I remember sitting up immediately, placing my feet on the cold floor, and checking again as if repetition could somehow correct reality. It did not. The transaction list loaded slowly, each second stretching longer than it should have, until finally I saw the entry that confirmed everything. It was not random. It was not unfamiliar. It was tied to a device and account access I had seen before, and that was the moment my thoughts stopped being confusion and started becoming recognition. My brother, Ethan Harper, had always had indirect access to certain shared financial tools we used within the family. It had never been a problem before, or at least I had never thought it would become one. We had grown up trusting each other with small things, passwords shared once and forgotten, conveniences that made life easier until suddenly they became risks instead of help. I sat there for a long moment, still holding my phone, not moving, not speaking, just trying to reconstruct the timeline of how this could have happened without me noticing until now. The transaction timestamp was 7:35 de la mañana, which meant it had happened only minutes before I saw it. That detail made everything sharper, because it meant I was not dealing with something old or hidden in the past. I was dealing with something active, something recent, something that was still unfolding in real time. I stood up and walked to the kitchen without thinking, my phone still in my hand, trying to steady my breathing as I poured myself a glass of water I did not immediately drink. My mind kept returning to Ethan, not in an emotional sense at first, but in a logical reconstruction of access, demean, and opportunity. I thought about the last time I had spoken to him, the last time he had been near my phone, the last time he had asked casual questions about finances that I had answered without suspicion. None of it felt alarming in isolation, but now every small interaction began to form a pattern I had not noticed before. I opened the banking app again and refreshed the screen repeatedly, not because I expected the money to return, but because I needed confirmation that I was not misunderstanding what I was seeing. The balance remained unchanged in its absence. That was when the emotional response finally caught up with the logic. It was not just about money. It was about access, trust, and the simple fact that someone close enough to me had made a decision that directly impacted my financial stability without my consent. I leaned against the counter and looked at the time again. 7:35 de la mañana. It felt too precise to be accidental, too specific to be random, and too recent to be disconnected from immediate action. I did not call Ethan right away. I did not message anyone. Instead, I stood in silence, realizing that whatever came next would not be about discovering what happened, because I already knew that. It would be about deciding what I was going to do with the fact that it had already happened. The first thing I did after realizing the money was gone was sit back down, not because I felt calm, but because I understood that reacting emotionally would not help me recover anything or understand the full situation. I kept my phone in my hand and stared at the transaction again, studying every detail that the banking app provided. The timestamp, the account routing, the device authorization note, everything was there in a structured format that removed any possibility of it being random. The more I examined it, the clearer it became that this was not a technical error or a system malfunction. It was an authorized action, and that meant someone had intentionally accessed my funds with valid credentials. My mind immediately returned to Ethan, not as an accusation at first, but as a logical endpoint in a narrowing set of possibilities. I began mentally tracing every moment in the past week where access could have been gained or misused. We had shared household financial tools in the past for convenience, things like emergency transfers or temporary access during family situations, and I realized now that those conveniences created a vulnerability I had never properly reassessed. I stood up and began walking slowly through my apartment, not with direction, but as a way to process information without remaining frozen in one place. The quiet of the morning no longer felt peaceful. It felt suspended, like everything normal had paused around a single unresolved event. I opened my laptop on the kitchen table and logged into my banking account through the browser this time, wanting to see if the desktop interface revealed anything additional. The same transaction appeared, unchanged, confirming again that the issue was not visual or temporary. I leaned forward, scanning for any secondary access logs, and found something that made the situation more concrete. There had been a device confirmation linked to Tan's known login pattern, a pattern I recognized from previous shared account activity. It was not new access, but familiar access used in a way that I had not authorized. That distinction mattered more than anything else. It meant trust had not been bypassed, it had been used. I closed the laptop slowly and sat back in my chair, allowing the information to settle without interruption. My thoughts were no longer focused on whether Ethan had done it, because the technical evidence had already answered that. The question shifting in my mind now was why it had happened and how far it had gone beyond this single transaction. I considered calling him, but I did not move immediately. Instead, I looked at the time again. It was still early, just past the hour where most people begin their day but before they are fully engaged in it. I realized that whatever response I made would shape the rest of the morning, and likely much more than that. I walked to the window and looked outside at the quiet street, noticing how ordinary everything appeared compared to the internal shift that had just occurred. Cars passed slowly, people moved toward work, and nothing reflected the fact that I had just confirmed a financial breach involving someone I trusted. I returned to the table and sat down again, placing my phone face up in front of me. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it without touching anything, allowing the silence to exist without filling it with immediate reaction. Then I opened my contacts and hovered over Ethan's name. I did not press call yet. Instead, I stayed in that moment of controlled pause, fully aware that whatever I chose to do next would not just address the missing money, but define the boundary between assumption and accountability moving forward. For several minutes I remained seated with my phone still resting on the table, my finger no longer hovering over Ethan's contact, because something in me had shifted from immediate reaction to structured observation. I was no longer trying to understand whether the money had been taken, because that part of the situation had already been confirmed beyond doubt. What I was now focused on was timing, intent, and the sequence of decisions that had led to a transaction of $7,650 appearing at exactly 7:35 de la mañana. I opened the banking dashboard again, this time not to verify the loss, but to study the surrounding data more carefully. I checked login history, authorization timestamps, and device identifiers, comparing them against what I knew of shared access patterns within our family accounts. Ethan had used linked permissions before, usually for small transfers or temporary adjustments, but those actions had always been discussed or at least acknowledged afterward. This time, there was no message, no explanation, and no indication that the transaction had been intended as anything other than a direct withdrawal. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, realizing that the situation was no longer about confusion but about confirmation layered over certainty. I stood up again and walked to the kitchen, more out of habit than necessity, and poured a glass of water that I did not immediately drink. My mind was no longer racing, but it was processing in a controlled and structured way, isolating each fact as if it were part of a timeline I needed to reconstruct accurately before taking any action. I thought about Ethan's behavior over the past few weeks, not in emotional terms, but in patterns of access and convenience. There had been moments where he had asked about account visibility, about transfer speed, and about shared permissions that I had previously dismissed as casual curiosity. Now those moments formed a different narrative when placed next to the transaction record in front of me. I returned to the table and opened a secure banking log export, reviewing deeper system data that was not visible in the basic mobile interface. That is when I saw it again, the device signature that matched Ethan's known login profile, confirming that the access was not only authorized but also consistent with his previous activity footprint. There was no ambiguity left in the technical evidence. The money had not disappeared. It had been taken through valid credentials. He closed the laptop slowly and sat in silence for a moment, allowing the weight of that realization to settle without interruption. The question of what happened had been replaced entirely by what happens next, and I understood that this decision point required precision rather than impulse. I finally picked up my phone again and looked at Ethan's name on the screen. My finger rested over the call button, but I did not press it yet. Instead, I considered what kind of conversation would actually produce clarity instead of denial. A direct accusation would lead to defense. A vague inquiry would lead to avoidance. Neither would resolve the structural issue I was now clearly seeing. He lowered the phone slightly and looked out the window again, noticing how unchanged the outside world remained despite the internal shift that had occurred inside me. Cars still moved through the street, people still continued their routines, and yet my morning had already diverged into something entirely different. He returned my attention to the phone and placed it face up on the table again, not as avoidance, but as controlled delay. I understood now that the most important action was not immediate confrontation, but deliberate response, because whatever Ethan had done at 7:35 de la mañana had already started a chain that would not stop on its own. After sitting in silence for a long stretch of time, I finally stood up again, not because I had reached a conclusion, but because remaining still any longer was no longer helping me process what I already knew. The situation had shifted from discovery to containment, and I could feel that distinction clearly now. The money was gone, the transaction was confirmed, and Ethan's digital footprint had already been verified through the banking system's own logs. There was no longer a question of whether something had happened. The only remaining uncertainty was how far the situation extended beyond this single withdrawal and what the appropriate response would be in a family context where trust and access had been intertwined for years. He walked slowly through my apartment again, this time not checking my phone repeatedly, but instead focusing on the structure of what I would need to do next. Contacting Ethan was still an option, but I was no longer considering it as the first step. He understood now that a direct confrontation without preparation would likely result in denial or deflection, and neither outcome would recover the funds or clarify intent. He opened my laptop again and began reviewing account permissions in detail, moving beyond transaction history into access control settings. He wanted to see exactly what level of authorization Ethan still had and whether there were any remaining pathways through which he could continue to interact with shared financial tools. As I navigated through the settings, I noticed how many of the permissions had been granted in earlier family convenience arrangements, not formal financial agreements. That realization made the situation feel less like a sudden breach and more like a structural vulnerability that had existed unnoticed until it was actively used. He took notes quietly on a separate document, listing each access point, each authorization level, and each account link that needed to be addressed. The process was methodical, not emotional, because I knew that clarity would be more useful than reaction in whatever came next. At one point I paused and looked at the original transaction again, the one that had occurred at exactly 7:35 de la mañana. The precision of the timing still stood out to me, not because it changed the facts, but because it suggested intention rather than coincidence. He leaned back in my chair and considered the possibility that Ethan had not acted impulsively, but had chosen a specific moment when attention would be minimal and reaction delayed. That possibility changed the emotional weight of the situation, but it also reinforced the need for a structured response rather than an immediate emotional one. He closed my laptop for a moment and walked to the window again, looking out at the steady movement of the street below. Everything outside remained unchanged, which contrasted sharply with the internal recalibration I was experiencing. He realized that from an external perspective, nothing about my morning would appear different, yet internally the framework of trust within my family had already shifted into a different category entirely. When I returned to the table, I opened a new secure note and began outlining a step-by-step plan for how to address both the financial recovery and the access removal. It was not yet a plan of confrontation, but a plan of containment and correction. He knew I would eventually need to speak to Ethan, but I also understood that the conversation would need to happen after I had already stabilized the system that had been compromised. As I finished writing the final point in my outline, I sat back again and placed my phone beside the laptop. For the first time since discovering the transaction, I was no longer reacting to the situation as it unfolded. He was preparing to define its boundaries. By the time I finished outlining the containment steps, the situation had shifted again from analysis into execution planning, and I could feel the difference in how my mind was organizing the information. It was no longer looping through shock or uncertainty, but instead structuring each piece of data into a sequence of actions that would restore control over the accounts and remove any remaining unauthorized access. He opened my laptop again and began implementing the first step of my plan, which was to review every linked device currently associated with my banking profile. The list populated slowly, each entry appearing one by one, and I scanned carefully for anything connected to Ethan's known devices. It did not take long before I confirmed what I had already suspected. His device was still listed as an active trusted login, meaning that even after the transaction at 7:35 de la mañana, access had not been revoked. That realization made the situation feel more urgent, not because the money had not been recovered, but because the pathway that allowed it to be taken was still open. He immediately initiated the removal process for all non-essential devices, carefully verifying each prompt before confirming changes. As I worked, I remained focused on precision rather than emotion, because I understood that mistakes in this stage could create further vulnerabilities rather than resolve them. Once the device removal process was complete, I moved to the next step, which involved updating authentication credentials across all associated accounts. He created new secure passwords, enabled additional verification layers, and ensured that recovery options were no longer tied to shared family contacts. Each adjustment felt like tightening a system that had previously been too loosely connected, and with each completed step, I could feel the structure becoming more secure and less exposed. After finishing the technical adjustments, I sat back and reviewed everything once more, checking for anything I might have missed. The system now reflected full control on my side, with no remaining active permissions that could be used without my authorization. Only after confirming this did I allow myself to pause. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the time again, noticing that several hours had passed since the initial discovery. The morning. Outside had fully developed, and the city was now in its normal rhythm, completely unaware of the internal restructuring that had just taken place in my financial and personal boundaries. I picked up my phone again and looked at Ethan's contact. The decision to call him was no longer uncertain. He pressed the call button and waited, listening as the line began to ring. While waiting, I thought carefully about how the conversation needed to be handled. There would be no ambiguity, no open-ended questions, and no emotional escalation. The purpose was no longer discovery, because discovery had already happened. It was confirmation, accountability, and the establishment of consequences that matched the actions already taken. When the call connected, I remained silent for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to ensure that the structure I had just built would not be undermined by an unprepared response. On the other end, I could hear movement before his voice came through, casual at first, unaware of the full context. That contrast between his tone and my understanding of the situation made everything feel even more defined. He spoke clearly and calmly, stating only what was necessary, referencing the exact transaction amount and the time it occurred. There was no accusation in my tone, only factual confirmation. The silence that followed on his end was immediate and noticeable, and in that silence, I understood that the conversation had already shifted into a different phase, one where denial would no longer change the structure of what had already been corrected. The moment Ethan's silence stretched on the other end of the call, I could immediately tell that the conversation had moved into a space where denial would be the first instinct rather than clarity. He remained steady, keeping my tone unchanged, because I understood that emotional escalation would only create noise around something that needed to stay precise. I repeated the key details once more, the exact amount of $7,650, and the exact time of 7:35 a.m., making sure there was no ambiguity in what I was referencing. On the other end, he heard a shift in his breathing pattern, followed by a brief hesitation before he responded. His voice was lower than before, less casual, as if he had not expected the conversation to begin with such direct confirmation. He attempted at first to question the transaction in a vague way, suggesting confusion, but I did not interrupt or react emotionally. Instead, I allowed the silence after his statement to settle, because I wanted him to hear the absence of validation in that silence more than any argument I could have added. After a moment, I calmly stated that the transaction logs had already been verified, and that the device authorization matched his known access profile. He did not accuse him beyond the facts, because the facts themselves were already sufficient. There was another pause on his side, longer this time, and I could sense the shift from confusion into realization that this was not a conversation based on speculation. He moved slightly away from the kitchen counter and sat down again, maintaining the same steady tone, explaining that all shared access had already been removed and that the system had been secured on my end. He made it clear that I was not calling to argue, but to confirm and address what had already occurred. His response became more defensive at that point, attempting to frame the situation in a way that suggested misunderstanding or temporary access usage, but I stayed focused on the structure of the issue rather than the justification. He reminded him again that the funds had left the account at a specific time, through a specific authorization, and that those facts could not be reinterpreted after the system logs had already recorded them. Another silence followed, this one heavier, and I could hear movement in the background on his end, as if he had physically shifted away from whatever he was doing when I called. He did not rush him to respond, because I was no longer trying to extract an explanation. He was observing how he would react when the assumption of ambiguity was no longer available. After several seconds, he asked if I had locked all access, and I confirmed that I had. There was a noticeable change in his tone after that, less defensive and more unsettled, as if the realization of containment had finally registered. He did not escalate the conversation further. Instead, I stated that the purpose of the call was not to debate intent, but to ensure there would be no further unauthorized access and that the situation was now formally addressed. He paused briefly before ending the call, not abruptly, but deliberately, allowing the final silence between us to carry the weight of what had just been confirmed. When the line disconnected, I placed the phone back on the table and remained seated for a moment, noticing that the urgency I had felt earlier in the morning had now transitioned into a different state, one defined not by reaction, but by control that had already been re-established. After the call ended, the silence in my apartment felt different from the silence I had experienced earlier that morning. It was no longer the silence of discovery or analysis, but the silence that follows confirmation, where all necessary information has already been exchanged and what remains is only consequence. He sat still for a moment with my phone resting face up on the table, watching the screen as if expecting it to react on its own, even though I knew there was nothing left for it to reveal. The transaction had already been confirmed, the access had already been secured, and the conversation with Ethan had already clarified that he now understood the situation was no longer ambiguous. He leaned back in my chair and allowed my attention to shift from the immediate tension of the call into the broader structure of what had just changed. The financial breach was no longer active, but its impact was still unfolding in ways that were not purely technical. He opened my laptop again and checked the banking dashboard once more, not because I expected anything new, but because I wanted to confirm stability. Linked devices remained removed, authentication layers were active, and there were no pending transfers or unfamiliar login attempts. The system was now fully under my control again, and that fact created a clear boundary between what had happened and what could no longer happen. He closed the laptop slowly and stood up, walking toward the window as I processed the shift in dynamics. Old City, the city continued its normal rhythm, cars moving through intersections, people walking along sidewalks, everything functioning without awareness of the internal restructuring that had just taken place in my financial and personal boundaries. He noticed my phone vibrate briefly on the table behind me, and when I turned back, I saw a message notification from Ethan appear on the screen. He did not open it immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, observing the notification without engaging with it, understanding that the timing of the message itself was part of the response pattern I had anticipated. Eventually I picked up the phone and opened it. The message was brief, attempting to frame the situation as confusion and suggesting that the transaction may have been misunderstood or misinterpreted. I read it once, then again, not because I needed clarification, but because I was analyzing how quickly the narrative was shifting after the call ended. There was no acknowledgement of intent, only a gradual repositioning toward uncertainty, as if the facts could still be softened through language. He placed the phone back down without replying and returned to the kitchen, where I poured another glass of water and took a slow moment to think through the next phase. The financial system was secure, but the relational system was still unstable, and I understood that those two systems would now evolve separately. He opened my notes again and added a final section to my documentation, marking the exact time of resolution of access control changes and the confirmation of unauthorized transaction acknowledgement. He wanted a clear record not only of what had happened, but of how it had been resolved step by step. As I finished writing, I noticed another notification appear on my phone, this time not a message but a repeated attempt to contact me. He did not respond. Instead, I sat back and observed the pattern emerging in real time, recognizing that the shift from control to reaction had now moved to the other side of the situation. This structure was no longer unstable on my yin. It had already stabilized. What remained was the consequence phase, where understanding slowly replaced assumption for everyone involved, whether they were ready for it or not. After reviewing the pattern of incoming notifications and repeated call attempts, I remained seated for a long moment without responding, allowing the situation to settle into its next phase without any immediate input from me. The financial system had already been secured, the unauthorized access had already been removed, and the initial confrontation with Ethan had already confirmed that he understood the seriousness of the situation. What was happening now was not discovery anymore, but reaction, and I could see that clearly in the way the messages were being sent in increasingly frequent intervals. I placed my phone face down on the table and focused instead on the documentation I had been building since the morning. The structured notes I had created earlier now served a different purpose, not just as a record of events, but as a reference point for how quickly control had been re-established once decisive action was taken. He added a final timestamp indicating the latest access attempt notifications, noting that despite repeated contact efforts, no further unauthorized transactions had occurred since the system lockdown. That detail mattered because it confirmed that the issue was no longer active, only residual in communication form. He stood up and walked slowly through my apartment again, not out of urgency, but to maintain clarity while thinking through what the next interaction should look like if Ethan continued attempting contact. He understood that at this stage, any conversation would no longer be about facts, because the facts had already been established and verified. It would now be about interpretation, responsibility, and how each side chose to frame what had already happened. He stopped near the kitchen counter and looked at my phone again as it lit up with another notification. This time it was not just a message, but a missed call alert followed by another attempt almost immediately after. The pattern was no longer random. It was escalation driven by lack of response. He did not answer. Instead, I opened my notes and added a final observation, documenting the transition from initial denial to repeated contact attempts following confirmation of account security changes. The structure of the situation was now clearly divided into two phases. The first phase had been access and withdrawal. The second phase was response and realization. He leaned against the counter and took a slow breath, recognizing that my role in this situation had already shifted from reactive participant to controlled observer. He was no longer trying to recover information or establish what had happened, because that had already been fully resolved through technical verification and direct communication. What remained now was simply the aftermath of that resolution moving through the other side of the relationship. He checked the phone again briefly and saw another message appear, shorter this time, less structured, suggesting urgency rather than explanation. He did not engage with it. Instead, I placed the phone back down and returned to my seat at the table. The apartment remained quiet, but the silence now felt different from earlier in the morning. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty or analysis. It was the silence of completion, where the system had already been corrected and all remaining activity existed outside of my need to respond. He looked at the documentation one more time and closed the file, not because the situation was finished in a relational sense, but because it was finished in a structural sense. The boundaries had already been set, the access had already been removed, and the consequences were now unfolding independently of my input. And in that understanding, I recognized that the most important shift was no longer about the money itself, but about the fact that control had already been re-established, and everything that followed would now take place within that new structure. By the time the final wave of notifications stopped appearing on my phone, the apartment had settled into a level of silence that felt fundamentally different from earlier in the day. It was no longer the silence of discovery, nor the silence of analysis, nor even the silence of controlled response. It was the silence that follows completion, where every necessary action has already been taken and the remaining system simply continues without needing further intervention. I sat at the table with my phone face up, not because I expected anything new, but because I wanted to observe the final state of the situation without participating in it anymore. There were no new transactions, no unauthorized access attempts, and no system alerts. Everything confirmed that the financial structure had been fully stabilized on my side. What remained was entirely external now, existing only in communication attempts that no longer required my response. I opened my notes one last time and reviewed the timeline I had documented from the initial alert at 7:35 de la mañana through the verification, the system lockdown, the direct conversation, and the subsequent escalation of contact attempts. Seeing it laid out in sequence made the progression feel linear and contained, rather than chaotic or emotional. Each phase had led logically into the next without deviation once proper action had been taken. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, allowing myself to fully recognize that there was nothing left to fix, adjust, or recover. The money had already been lost and that loss had already been structurally addressed. Ethan's access had already been removed, and his awareness of that fact had already been confirmed through our call. Everything after that point had been reaction, not impact. He stood up and walked slowly through my apartment, not searching for anything in particular, but acknowledging the space in which the entire situation had unfolded. The kitchen where I had first confirmed the transaction. The table where I had traced access logs. The window where I had observed the unchanged rhythm of the outside world. All of it now felt like part of a closed sequence rather than an ongoing crisis. He paused near the counter and picked up my phone one final time. There were no new messages at that moment, only the remnants of earlier attempts. He did not feel the need to respond anymore, not because of avoidance, but because the purpose of communication had already been fulfilled in the earlier exchange. The facts were established. The access was removed. The structure was corrected. He placed the phone back down and turned off the screen, letting the absence of activity reinforce the finality of the situation. He looked around the apartment once more and realized that nothing in the environment reflected what had happened internally throughout the day. Everything appeared ordinary, unchanged, and neutral. That contrast made the conclusion even clearer. The event had not altered the physical space. It had only redefined the boundaries within it. He returned to the table and sat down for a final moment, not to think further, but simply to acknowledge that the cycle had completed itself. What began at 7:35 de la mañana with an unexpected transaction had moved through discovery, verification, correction, and response, and had now reached a state where no further action was required. And in that final stillness, I understood that control was not regained through confrontation, but through the quiet certainty that the system could no longer be accessed without permission.